The takeaway thus far, clearly, is that transphobes have actual brain damage, and the hate and vitriol that they spew almost always comes back around to them.
Candace Owens has thrown out a crazy conspiracy theory, one that I had not heard before. This is a wild one, and I thought this was a bit of a palate cleanser after nonstop talk of Elon Musk and Donald Trump. The Humanist report broke all this down. We're going to take a look at clips from the Humanist report. I'm going to share my thoughts on this as well. Let's get into this together.
They basically were just like, look at cute little Brigitte Macron sitting on her mother's lap. And instantly, I promise you, I hadn't even looked into the primary source of the story. And I said, well, that's weird, because Brigitte looks to me like the person on the far left. The person on the lap doesn't look anything like Brigitte. Whatever. Then I looked at photo 2 that they presented, and I went, wait, Brigitte's quite old. This does not look like a photo that is that old.
You just got a small taste of the rantings of right-wing lunatic Candace Owens, who helped to promote the conspiracy theory that the French president's wife, Brigitte Macron, is transgender. And according to Candace, the evidence that Bridget presented from her childhood to prove that she's indeed cis was illegitimate because, according to Candace, let me see if I can get this right, the person who she claimed was her brother was actually her pre-transition, and then the other photo from her childhood is actually just a picture of her daughter that they made look old. Now, it turns out Bridget Macron is not trans, but even if she was, for a second, let's just entertain that. Even if she was, who cares? What exactly am I supposed to do with this information, assuming Candace Owens was able to prove it? Is this going to lower the cost of eggs, Candace? Who is and isn't trans is none of anybody's business, and trans women are women, period, so it doesn't change anything about Bridget. And to even care at all about this, you have to be an idiot or a pervert, or both. I mean, you never met Bridget, so why would you care so much about whether or not she's trans? Like, I'm trying to figure out, like, why? What goes through the brains of people like Candace Owens? Now, in the end, 2 French YouTubers who also propagated this lie were actually sued for libel in order to pay 8,000 euros to Bridget and another 5,000 to her brother. But in all fairness to Candace, she didn't start this conspiracy theory, but I mean, she certainly helped to popularize it, and she made it go viral. But now the tables have turned because the transvestigator has become the transvestigated. And I say this because fellow transphobe Ian Miles Chong tweeted a picture of Candace Owens as a child where she had a pixie haircut and was wearing flannel. And I guess that's evidence that Candace is trans now? Is that what we're claiming? Now, when somebody pointed out to him that she's cis because she's pregnant, he responded with another picture of Candace Owens where he insinuates that she has a penis because of the way her pants is. Now, there's also this screenshot circulating on Twitter of somebody claiming, without evidence, by the way, that they knew Candace before she transitioned and they know her dead name. But while this intellectually stimulating conversation took place, guess what Candace Owens was doing? She was continuing to double down on this now years-long transvestigation of Brigitte Macron, and she was promoting her investigative series, her quote-unquote investigative series, proving that Brigitte Macron is trans. And I wish that I could tell you that this was an isolated incident of idiocy, but it's not.
I want to stop this here for just a minute. So first of all, I want to say I agree with him. I don't know why anyone would care in the United States about anything that has to do with the wife of the president of France, let alone whether or not she's trans. So that's the first thing. But there must be a lot of people that care, because on the screenshot there, she said 2.3 million views in 36 hours. So that's obviously why she's doing this. She's getting a lot of clicks and views, Candace Owens is. But the obsession, the transphobia obsession, to me is just bizarre. I don't know why there are so many people spending this much time thinking about other people in this way. But it's something, the right wing has, they've made this their bread and butter. They're obsessed with trans people, talking about trans people and being anti-trans people. My next point is just conspiracy theories and conspiracy theorists in general. I guess it's probably because of social media, but I don't know that there's ever been a time with more conspiracy theorists. It just seems like, everything now is a conspiracy theory. Everyone is a conspiracy theorist. I asked some friends the other day, I said, can you think of any subject that there isn't some kind of a conspiracy theory that someone believes? You know, obviously there are flat earthers out there. I'm sure there are people that believe that gravity doesn't exist, any number of other things. And my friends couldn't come up with one. They couldn't think of anything that there wouldn't be some conspiracy tied to. Let me know in the comments if you can think of anything. But the other thing that I'd like to say is when I was a kid, in elementary school, I loved to read about Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and aliens and ghosts and all of these things. And at some point, I outgrew that. I realized, these things aren't real. I wanted them to be real when I was a kid, and I loved to watch shows about the paranormal and cryptozoology and all of that. But at some point, I outgrew that. But my theory, I think conspiracy theorists are people who never outgrew that way of thinking. They never really developed critical thought to be like, this doesn't really make that much sense. I liken it to people who never stopped believing in Santa Claus. And I don't mean that in the way of all the idea of Santa Claus and how wonderful Christmas and all that is. I'm talking an adult who would believe that Santa Claus is a real person. That's kind of how I think of conspiracy theorists. They're just sort of people who never grew up and never developed any critical thinking or any logical thought. But the funny thing is, with all of the right-wingers like Candace Owens, they don't want to look at the real conspiracies. The major real conspiracy that we have in our society is that the rich are trying to control everything. And that's nothing that's hidden. I mean, we're seeing it right now with what's happening with Elon Musk. It's right out there in the open, but they don't want to acknowledge that because that goes against their worldview that it's actually the poor that are somehow controlling everything and trying to steal all the money from the rich instead of the other way around.
In fact, it happens all the time. J.K. Rowling, who's publicly transvestigated multiple women and is being sued by one of them because of it, has been transvestigated herself. We've talked about it on the program before. Nancy Mace, who I think she thinks of herself as the final boss of trans people, was also the subject of online transvestigations. I talked about that too. And speaking of Nancy Mace real quick, she was attacked by a fellow transphobe in the middle of a transphobic attack that she was doing because her anti-trans argument was too woke. Let me show you what I mean. So she tweeted out a picture of her accomplishments saying, "I didn't fight like hell to become the first woman to graduate from the Citadel just for some man in a miniskirt to take away that achievement." Now, Matt Walsh, also a transphobe who actually made an anti-trans documentary, responded to that, calling her DEI and accusing her of making the same argument that trans people make, saying, "The Citadel was a male-only space forced by law to admit females in the name of diversity and inclusion. This is the exact argument trans-identifying males use to invade female spaces. Nancy Mace was literally a beneficiary of a DEI program. It's a ridiculous and tone-deaf thing to brag about in this moment." And the takeaway thus far, clearly, is that transphobes have actual brain damage, and the hate and vitriol that they spew almost always comes back around to them. But to get back to Candace Owens for a moment, I need people to understand that the transvestigations that we're seeing aren't just used by transphobes for sensationalist purposes or for grifting. They're actually much more serious than that. Transvestigations are part of a broader plan to eliminate trans people from public life, because the goal isn't to get you to question whether or not Bridget Macron actually is trans. These types of transvestigations are priming people to think that being trans in general is something that's inherently bad. Bigots like Candace Owens deliberately foment paranoia and hysteria in order to lay the groundwork for the trans erasure that we're seeing right now by the Trump administration. It's the creation of a boogeyman by pundits like her that Republican politicians like Trump can slay.
And he's right about this. They always have to have a boogeyman. They can't, they do plenty of dog whistles, but they can't be quite as openly racist as they were back in the 50s or 60s and just say all of our problems in our society are because of black people. Or they can't be quite as open as they once would have been about gay people. They say, oh, all of our problems are because of gay people. Now they've moved on to immigrants and trans people. So those are what they view as the socially acceptable, because they do have, there are millions and millions of people, sadly, that agree with them that trans people and immigrants are this major problem. So they're able to use them in their propaganda and to get votes. And there are some people that think that the anti-trans message, the anti-trans things that were said throughout Donald Trump's campaign were one of the things that helped him to get reelected. But I want to go back to Nancy Mace for a minute. This is funny to me because she comes out, she seems to be proud that she got into the Citadel, went through the Citadel, but guess what, Nancy? They don't like you either. So while they're railing against the trans people just existing in society, but in different spaces and particularly in sports, they also, this is the thing that's really funny to me, is all the men now who are suddenly so concerned about women's sports were making fun of women's sports 5 minutes ago. The NBA, nobody watches the NBA, nobody cares about that, but they're suddenly concerned that someone who is trans would be playing in the NBA or playing in women's college sports that they care nothing about. And it's the same thing with Matt Walsh here and Nancy Mace. They don't want trans people in those spaces, but they don't want Nancy Mace in those spaces either. They want everything to be straight white male controlling every aspect of our society and our country. So I often think, and I think it becomes more relevant all the time, the old poem from World War II about first they came for, and you see different variations of this, but I think it was, I'm just going off the top of my head, but I think first they came for the socialists and I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for then they came for this group, then they came for that group, then they came for the Jews and I wasn't a Jew. Now they've come for me and there's no one else to speak up for me or fight for me or whatever. So Nancy Mace, they're going to come for you at some point. They don't really, they don't want there to be women in the Citadel or the military. They don't want women to be in Congress. So they're eventually going to come for the women like Nancy Mace who have aligned themselves with the far right. And that's in the end, going to be a losing proposition for them. But let me know what you think about this, what the Humanist report had to say, this obsession with trans people, and this conspiracy theory from Candace Owens is just insane. And why anyone would care about it, I don't know. But as she showed, she had millions of views on her video about that. Let me know what you think in the comments. Make sure to give me a like and subscribe. I'm Chris on Culture, and I will see you in the next video.